Welcome everyone to our second episode of Infrastructure Insights, and I'm delighted to say we've been joined by a very special guest, Natasha Rouse from Equitix. Natasha is a senior leader in the infrastructure sector with extensive experience across transport, social infrastructure, power and utilities. Natasha is a director and head of social infrastructure for Equitix, a leading infrastructure investor. And prior to joining Equitix, Natasha built a very successful infrastructure advisory business for Arcadis. So Natasha, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Like we always try to do with our guests, we'd like to get a sense of your background, if you like. So if you could just give our sort of listeners a sense of well, what led you to getting into the infrastructure sector? Was it some sort of bright idea you had, or conversation, or by chance?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, it certainly wasn't a planned route or a planned career for me. I have fallen into infrastructure by chance, but about 25, 30 years ago, very early in my career, but I stayed in infrastructure by choice. And what I really like about infrastructure, now infrastructure investment world, where I've been working for a number of years, is the fact that what we invest in and what we manage is very tangible. You can point at it, you can touch it, although obviously with power and renewables, you don't want to touch it too much. So what we build and what we invest in and what we run is a real legacy. And it sounds rather high-handed, but in effect, without the assets that we invest in and own and operate, our life, everybody's life, would be very much harder and very different to what we are used to and what we enjoy. You know, you get in the car, I'm sure you got in the car at some point in the last 24 hours, and you drove on a perfectly nice road and you switched the lights on and you had electricity, and you opened the tap and you had running water. And all of that is infrastructure. And all of that does not get noticed on a daily basis. And we only talk about problems when problems occur. But well delivered, well performing infrastructure is at the very core of everybody's life in this country and our society. So, as I said, I've fallen into it by chance, but I've stayed in it because I do enjoy being able to demonstrate and describe what is it I do and how does it add to everybody's quality of life.
Really interesting point, that, and the tangible assets, people that can see and help them get from A to B. That's something that sounds like it's kind of kept you in the industry. And it kind of leads nicely to my second question, really, which is really about just keen to get a sense there of what you love, what you really enjoy about the sector. You've touched on it there already in terms of what's kept you in for this time, but is there anything else there which you haven't mentioned in the first bit?
Well, I've spent earlier part of my career in engineering and technical advisory,
Hmm.
and I must say, going on site, being able to see things built, having exciting opportunities to be inside a tunnel boring machine and in a tunnel that is being built, or on site of a high-speed railway line in France, or even looking at sort of early implementation of ESG assets of major construction projects, the bat tunnels and the beaver rescue and the special frogs that needed to be accommodated in design and construction. So that in the earlier part of my career was really attractive and both challenging and very stimulating and very interesting. I think at the latter kind of phase in my career in the last 5, 6 years with Equitix, what's really interesting is how can we use and leverage investment into creating economic growth. And working for Equitix, we are one of the biggest investors in social infrastructure. Now, there is again a very direct and tangible link between what we do and how, in particular, school, hospitals, all of the things that all of the social facilities that we all rely on are performing and what they're delivering to the general public. So, I started sort of being interested in the construction process and how it all gets put together. But now I really enjoy the aspect of, I suppose, strategically looking at how can we help with economic growth in the country. And again, it kind of sounds quite high-handed, but I think at the size of the portfolio that we have, that myself and my colleagues manage, this is a really kind of tangible, real opportunity for us.
For sure. And, I think back to when we originally met, heard you sort of speaking on a panel earlier this year, and, you and Equitix, intrinsically involved in this link between private sector, public sector, social infrastructure. Just on this point, actually, and this was sort of something I was keen to hear your view on. It sort of feels that from where we sit, that PFI, PPP, private finance in general, perhaps not, should we say, flavour of the month with the previous UK government. I know we're still early days with this administration, but to what extent do you expect this to change with the new government? Have you seen any changes over the past few months? Clearly, there'll be a change in personnel in terms of people you'll be dealing with, but yeah, just keen to get your sense of the mood music, or if there's anything tangible about the hopes that you have for this.
Well, as always, politically, it's difficult to say, and I'm certainly not the best person to make that judgment. But from the indications that we're getting from different directions, actually, both on the sort of the level of assets that myself and my team manage, and on the levels of conversations and engagements we have through various industry associations and events, I think what's clear is that the need is massive. The need for investment in social infrastructure is massive, and it is going to continue to grow. It's not going to disappear just because we wish it so to do so. And with the aging population and the pressure, the fiscal pressure on the country, which is sort of well formulated now and well defined and quantified, no matter what we think about the numbers and the justification behind them, it is clear that there is a massive need and there is not enough resource, financial resource, and also human resource to actually fulfill that need from the public sector side alone. So to me, as a logical equation, it seems inevitable that some sort of private investment in public social infrastructure will continue to be necessary. A lot of it gets lost in somewhat sensationalist sometimes headlines about how bad or good PPP PFI is. I think recently, certainly in the last 6 to 9 months, there's been some more balanced representations in the press of what those programs are, what they have delivered, and what they are still delivering very quietly behind the scenes. And I think I've said that before, maybe at the event which you mentioned. So forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I think good PFI, good PPP is like good infrastructure. It only gets noticed when something goes wrong, but actually the 99% of cases where those facilities are delivering well and delivering good value for money, delivering good service to the public, they're not in the press, they don't get noticed, they're not particularly being shouted about. So I think a more balanced view on PPP, PFI as a model, it seems to be emerging. And longer term, in my mind, there is no doubt that there needs to be either reiteration, reincarnation of PPP, PFI, or some other model. Actually, the model is less important. What's more important is consistent, determined strategy that is going to bring public need and private investment together. And if we as a country can achieve that, I think if we don't, we're going to be in more serious trouble than where we are now. If as a country we can bring private interest and public interest together in whatever that model is and whatever it's called, and there's a number of candidates for that, then I think we'll be looking at development and maintenance of a pretty successful infrastructure stream in the next 10 to 15 years. So not a very direct answer to your question, but I'm not Prime Minister, and therefore, I'm not in the Treasury either, so I can't exactly tell you what the thinking is. But I think it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear your insights there, and particularly your observation there around how, with these types of initiatives, we'll only ever really hear about them in the wider public, but maybe when things go wrong, and there are examples there which the media can pick up on. So if there's perhaps more balanced representation in the trade press and wider media, then all the better. I suppose we're just going to have to see how the next year to 18 months goes as this administration beds in. But on the infrastructure investment point, there's been some recent articles, and I've listened to a few conversations about how investable, say for instance, UK water companies might be. And I think the point was that they were least attractive to infrastructure investors in Europe. Where on the flip side, UK energy companies the data seems to suggest that they're ranked as most attractive to infrastructure investors. So could you just give us a sense of, say, as an infrastructure investor, what makes an infrastructure company or an area attractive to investors?
Oh, this could be a very long conversation. So I'll try to focus on maybe a few key and somewhat obvious points. Infrastructure investment is long term. So the key alignment between the investor interests and typically we see investment in infrastructure from long-term investors who are either institutionals, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds. LGPS funds are a very big part of our client base, for example. So we manage a lot of LGPS money, as do a lot of our competitors in the industry. So the alignment there is a long-term horizon. And the other big and very important aspect of it is sustainable, predictable returns. So it is no accident that Equitix specializes in core infrastructure. Majority of our funds are 20 to 25 years. So we are long-term investor. We're not evergreen, but we're a long-term investor. So because that is what our client base needs, that's how they want their money to grow. So predictability and sustainability of returns is really important. And there's a number of aspects of why people invest in infrastructure vis-a-vis other types of asset classes that they would go for. So when you look at what's been happening in UK regulated utilities and water companies in the last 5 years, I think it's no surprise that the interest has dropped. If you looked at how attractive or interesting that particular sector or subsector within infrastructure was 10 years ago, you would have seen a very different picture. So what you're seeing is a very natural reaction to regulatory environment, political discourse, and some of the performance of some of the water companies that we've seen in the UK. The same has happened before, and will happen again with different sectors within energy. The same has happened before and will happen again in different sectors of transport. So I think probably what, in my view, and again, that's my personal view, what you're picking up on at this point in time is a short-term reaction to an immediate situation, rather than necessarily a reflection of long-term attractiveness of, say, regulated utilities or water industry as such, as an investable base. But the important aspect within all of this is regulatory framework and the government behavior. And that is something that we do need to watch very actively. And we do keep bringing in our conversations with various representatives within the government, because those kind of outlier companies in terms of performance do send a signal to the investors, and they do send a signal which is not as positive as it could be in the situation where actually infrastructure investment is a very geographically is a very competitive field, and UK has not necessarily been winning in the last 2 to 3 years vis-a-vis North America, for example. So if we're looking at the specifics, regulated utilities, water companies in particular, I think the drop in interest is a local reaction. But if we're looking in the longer term horizon, the way the regulator is handling it, and it has handled it, especially in the past, is probably sending a signal that is going to be taken into account at the next round of opportunities for investment in UK infrastructure.
Very interesting. So key takeaways from that then, long-term horizons, absolutely crucial and fundamental for infrastructure investors. But then paying particular attention to regulatory behavior or the behavior of, say, governments, for instance, where there's these kind of 5-year election cycles and how those kind of plates interact.
Indeed. Indeed, and I think it goes not just for the regulated utilities, I think it goes for any infrastructure investment. Fundamentally, so again, coming back to our sore issue of PPPs and PFIs in this country, when we look at what these contracts were designed to do and what they are achieving, fundamentally, they have decoupled the infrastructure investment and especially capital investment, so long-term, roofs on buildings, funded replacement of life cycle needs for continuation of life of each particular asset. They've decoupled that from the 5-yearly political cycle. So the headmaster of school no longer decides whether the funding is going to be spent on more teachers or is going to be reserved to replace the roof in 5 years' time. That's taken, that decision making has taken out of the hands of the people who, for very, very real reasons, because of very real pressures, otherwise would have to decide between operating expenditure and capital expenditure in the future. So the long-term nature of infrastructure requires that long-term thinking, which is always very difficult, and that let's admit it, objectively within our system is very difficult for politicians and public sector officials to do without this contractual layer of PPP, PFI concession, whatever it is, that locks funding and locks operational management over 20-25 years in somebody else's hands who has got the focus on that operational performance and life cycle stability of that particular asset. So regulated utilities is slightly different. Obviously, RAB is a different model, but it should achieve, in the right framework, it should achieve the same objective. And it does have the provision for regulatory reviews. It does have a provision for joint decision making. And I think where things went wrong, all parties need to look at what needs to be improved.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I was going to make a comment about stormy waters and having to weather these storms, couldn't resist it. But no, I'm sure we both of us could talk about these topics for a long time. But maybe just moving on in terms of the sort of things from a kind of macro perspective. And you've got such an interesting background, because I know you've been in infrastructure advisory as well before you joined Equitix on the infrastructure investment side. But what kind of trends are you seeing in the industry right now, which are particularly interesting to you and your intellectual interests, or interesting to Equitix, for instance, and the social infrastructure sector that you lead there?
Yes, again, it's a very very big topic. So let me pick just a few. I think what's interesting for me is in the core infrastructure, so in transport, social infrastructure, etc. Certainly in the European jurisdictions, and to a lesser degree in North America, we're seeing a move away from greenfield. So I think a lot of my traditional client base, when I was the advisor, it was mainly investors, but also major contractors. There's been a huge amount of consolidation in the industry. And mainly what we're looking at now is brownfield. So efficiency becomes the key word. It's a lot easier to build something from scratch and have it new and then operate it. It's a lot harder to have assets which are 10, 15 years old, or in case of some of the transport assets, roads, for example, in this country, they are 70, 100, 120, maybe going back to the Romans. So they're very old. And actually finding efficiencies and improvements in how those assets operate. So net zero comes into it as a big driver. So I think there's a lot more innovation in the industry now than there was 20 years ago that looks exactly at how do we make it greener? How do we make it more energy efficient? How do we make it less polluting? How do we make it future proof? So I think efficiency in existing assets and improving operational performance of existing assets is an area that I see developing a lot. AI comes into that in many forms and shapes. Managing data and information about existing assets and how do we drive efficiency from that comes into that in many forms and shapes. So that's a really interesting and multifaceted area in infrastructure, which I think is developing and is going to continue to develop quite significantly. And then, of course, we have parts of the world where greenfield construction is still developing, and there are plans and pipelines. Saudi Arabia, Middle East, India, Asia are still very active in that space. So it's an interesting divide where the greenfield pipeline in Europe is pretty much dried up, and I'm not just talking PPPs, I'm talking any major infrastructure development. Whereas in other parts of the world, it is ramping up and picking up. And of course, the obvious point that everybody would be picking up and everybody's discussing is the green transition and net zero. And what does that mean for infrastructure? And it's not just about, for example, in this country, improving the grid, building the network of EV charging. So, all of the topics that are in discussion all the time. But it's also, what does it mean for our existing infrastructure? What does it mean for our existing roads? What does it mean for our existing buildings? What does it mean for our existing parking spaces? So that adaptation, again, of existing infrastructure to new challenges and new objectives is a really interesting puzzle that the industry is trying to solve as a whole. And there are many parts and many parties involved in that solution. Investment is just one, and actually investment is probably the least challenging aspect of it at the moment. There's engineering solutions, there's scientific developments, there's still a lot of innovation that needs to be worked through in this industry. And government is also playing quite an important role in that.
So just to kind of link those two threads together there, the point there around how, we might hear more about greenfield construction, as in the creation of, say, for instance, new assets, perhaps less so the part about the existing assets and the sort of maintenance and driving efficiencies. That AI could be a big part of that. And then linking to the energy transition there, what impact will that have, say, for instance, in terms of EV charging, what impact will that have on existing infrastructure such as roads, for instance? So I think it's really interesting there how there can be a link between those sort of two observations. What's the, and I suppose this is sort of question thinking about your time with Equitix, but before as well, what's the most helpful advice that you've been given in your career that have come from someone that ex-boss, mentor, coach, could it be random conversation at the water station?
I've been very, very fortunate in my career. I had some fantastic colleagues and mentors who became friends and who gave me support at different stages in my career in different ways. But I'm very grateful to those individuals, and they know about it. But I think in combination, if I was to consolidate what they taught me, I think it would be two things: ask questions. And certainly when in the advisory world, if you don't ask questions, you're not going to get very far. And actually, that is how you learn and grow. Without asking questions, without exposing probably the areas of your own ignorance, and I have plenty of those, you're not actually going to learn anything new. And the other thing is actually find a mentor. And that's something that I have done, and I credit that to whatever success I have in my career. I credit it to the fact that I was all but always lucky to find the people who were willing to advise me and support me and help me through some tricky and difficult points. These two pieces of advice sound very primitive, but I think fundamentally they are the ones that I would carry forward in my career, and they're the ones that I always share with anyone who asks for my advice. So that would be the two pieces of wisdom that I'm happy to disclose.
Haha, no, that's great. Thank you for that. And it does come up against time and time in terms of um, people's ability to ask questions, but then listen to the answer without looking to sort of butt in or think of the next thing to say, and then ask questions from that, and that can lead to a sort of wider conversation. The thing about mentors, again, we do where we sit in the market, that kind of comes up in our conversations as well. And have you had the opportunity in the organizations that you've worked in to have access to mentors that work in the same company as you, or has that been you through your own wider networks? Approaching people who you used to know or used to work with, because we get asked that quite a lot in terms of our take on that, and I'm really interested to hear how you went about finding a mentor.
It was a bit of both. I think in most cases it happened naturally, and I don't think it was ever formal. So I wasn't, I mean, at the moment, I'm part of a mentoring framework, and so Equitix has put one in place last year. But generally, up until now, I wasn't part of any formal arrangement, but I always was lucky to either within the organizations within which I was working or outside of them come across people who were prepared to give me the time and were prepared to give me the support. And on a number of occasions, it was as simple as coming across somebody professionally and asking if they would be happy to support me or have a conversation with me, or not. I don't think I've ever asked anyone to mentor me formally, but basically support me through a difficult situation or share some advice or share some thinking. So I think it comes back to asking questions and asking for support when you need it, and being genuinely curious about the answers, being genuinely determined to find a different way forward and maybe challenge yourself and step out of your normal kind of standardized, we all become set in our ways, normal standardized approaches. So yes, it's probably a variety of different methods, both within my organizations and outside of them.
Thank you. No, that's really useful. And conversations I've had on this topic, even with people who've acted as kind of informal mentors, and people who've they've maybe been approached at conferences, and it's interesting how it can be a two-way beneficial relationship as well. It's very much the more senior person getting something from that as well, and it takes them out of their day-to-day responsibilities and actually thinking, actually, I've got quite a lot of wisdom to impart here, or helping someone how to go about networking within their all sorts of things. So it's that's really helpful to get your take on that, and what you've experienced and what's worked well for you. Just on that, kind of linking into what one of our sort of final questions, Natasha, what tips would you provide to, if there's people listening to this, if there's women within the infrastructure industry who are listening to this, what tips would you provide for them if they're looking to take their next step into a leadership role within infrastructure?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I think it would be not do not worry about being 100% competent and confident in taking a role, because and I think this is, I mean, it's a huge overgeneralization, but in my experience it tends to be a male female issue, where women genuinely in business, certainly in businesses where I work, felt that they needed to be 120% there before they step up. And I don't think that is a prerequisite. I don't think it's necessary. So confidence is a big piece. I think being open to being insecure and being uncomfortable is a prerequisite in the leadership role, because there will be times when you don't know, and therefore you have to go and do it anyway, even if you don't know, and even if you're not 100% confident in that. And the third piece is have your network, understand where your strengths are, and your strengths don't have to be on everything. So you don't need to be the best person in every single aspect of what needs to be done. Understand very clearly where your strengths are, and understand very clearly where you need other people to make a successful team, and use other people for their strengths and their abilities. So I think that's probably kind of the 3 or 4 foundational pieces for me in terms of stepping in leadership role. Trying to do it all yourself is not leadership. It's not constructive. It's not productive. Working with your network, working with your team, and bringing the best out of individuals that form that team, for me would be the definition of sort of the foundational piece for leadership, in my experience. Again, it will be different for different people.
Thank you for that. And there's some real sort of key takeaways there, and appreciate your thoughtful insights on that. And I knew it was a tough question. But just as we're sort of wrapping things up now, how do you feel? I mean, things have changed so much, even this year with the change of government, for instance, and various geopolitical events, which can have an impact on infrastructure and investment and so on. But although it's none of us have a magic wand, but from kind of where you sit in the industry, Natasha, the conversations that you're having, the dialogue you'll be in with all sorts of institutions and governments and private sector companies, in 12 months' time, what do you feel that the infrastructure investor advisory world is going to be talking about?
I expect that the allocations into infrastructure will grow. I mean, interest rate movements are in the right direction. Maybe they are not as fast or as quick on their downward trajectory as we would all like, but genuinely, I think what's been happening in the last year is positive. The need for infrastructure is growing and will continue to grow. So I think we do have positive outlook on how infrastructure as an asset class is going to develop in the next few years. And I think that outlook is shared generally within the infrastructure investment industry. So I'm not saying anything that people don't already know. So I think the focus is going to continue to be on essentially like infrastructure delivers the needs of the society, right? So that's what it is. So if you look globally at what do we need as a country, what do we need in a developed world, what do we need in a so-called developing world, that will tell you where the trajectory of the movement is going to be. So in Europe, without a doubt, it is more focused on green transition. It is more focused on energy efficiency. It is more focused on efficiency overall of operations of infrastructure assets. So I see a lot of growth and development in those areas. There is going to be new sectors to invest in. There is going to be new models of how that investment is structured, and how those, especially in the green transition and hydrogen, etc., what is going to be investable and how those subsectors are going to develop. But fundamentally, that will be the trajectory. There are huge parts of the world where very basic core infrastructure is badly needed. And there, I hope, sort of 10, 15 years horizon, we are going to be seeing more investment in greenfield infrastructure development. The difference there, hopefully, is going to be that all of the sort of intellectual and technical advances that we have made through first and second phase of infrastructure investment in this country and in Europe are going to be feeding into the infrastructure that is going to be developed and built in those countries where it's badly needed. And hopefully what is going to be built there is going to be more efficient and better performing than some of the some of the infrastructure that we're benefiting and have benefited from for the last 30, 40 years. So I think it's going to be different in different parts of the world, but fundamentally driven by what are the societal trends and what do we as population actually need to continue developing and continue to grow.
Fantastic. Well, look, it's been amazing to get your insights today, Natasha. I really appreciate your time and for giving thought to these questions. It's a pleasure to see you. And if we don't catch up before Christmas, all the best for the Christmas period. And I'm sure we'll catch up in 2025.
Thank you for inviting me.